The shuttle shuddered violently as it entered the atmosphere, its hull glowing red-hot from the rapid descent. Inside, the students of the Galactic Survival Academy braced themselves, gripping their harnesses as turbulence rattled their bones. Among them was Lieutenant Eric Carter, the only human in the class. He sat near the back, his expression calm despite the chaos around him. His fellow students, species from across the galaxy, whispered among themselves, occasionally casting skeptical glances in his direction. The shuttle's onboard AI announced their arrival. Final descent initiated. Surface impact in 10 seconds. With a final jolt, the shuttle touched down on the barren surface of the moon. The impact sent a cloud of dust spiraling into the air, thick and tinged with a faint blue hue. As the students unstrapped themselves and gathered their equipment, the ship's hatch hissed open, revealing the hostile landscape before them. The moon, designated Xiphos 9, was a wasteland of jagged rock formations and deep crevasses. Howling winds carried particles of toxic ice, sharp enough to tear through exposed skin. The sky was a dull, swirling mass of thick gray clouds, blocking out the distant sun. It was a place devoid of mercy. The assignment was simple in theory: survive for 72 hours and construct a shelter using only the available materials. On December 12, 1667, in practice, it was anything but. Professor Velcor, a towering reptilian being from the Othrexian system, stepped forward. His scales shimmered in the dim light, his yellow eyes scanning the students with calculated scrutiny. "You have all been trained in the principles of extreme survival," he announced, his voice a low growl. "This challenge will separate those who can apply their knowledge from those who merely understand theory. You will build a functional shelter, capable of withstanding the conditions of this moon. You have 72 hours. Fail, and you will be marked as unfit for advanced field work." He turned his gaze toward Eric, his slitted eyes narrowing slightly. "Humans are known for their unconventional methods. Let us see if such methods hold any value here." Eric met his gaze without flinching. He had encountered skepticism before. In a galaxy filled with species evolved to withstand the harshest environments, humans were often seen as fragile, primitive creatures. What most failed to understand was that adaptability was humanity's greatest strength. He nodded once, adjusting the straps of his pack before. The students scattered, each choosing a location to begin their work. Some gathered in small groups, discussing strategies in hushed tones, while others immediately began scanning the terrain for useful resources. Eric moved with purpose, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as he surveyed the area. The first thing he noticed was the wind, sharp, relentless, and dangerously cold. Prolonged exposure would be fatal. He pulled up the readings on his wrist device. The temperature had already dropped to minus 70 degrees Celsius, and the sun was barely touching the horizon. By nightfall, it would plummet even further. Shelter wasn't just important, it was a matter of life and death. While the other students debated structure designs and argued over optimal materials, Eric got to work. He had no intention of wasting time. Instinct told him that survival here wouldn't be about perfection. It would be about speed and efficiency. He jogged toward a small ridge where a scattering of jagged rocks jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Crouching beside one, he ran his gloved hand over its surface, testing its density. It was sturdy, heavier than expected. Good. Without hesitation, he began piling rocks together, forming the beginnings of a windbreak. He worked quickly, leveraging his strength to lift and stack the stones into a crescent shape. It wasn't much, but it would shield him from the worst of the wind while he worked on something more substantial. From the corner of his eye, he saw a trio of students watching him. One of them, a blue-skinned Itharian named Coril, let out a scoffing sound. "What is he doing?" she muttered to her companions. "Stacking rocks? That's not a shelter. That's barely even cover." Eric ignored them. He wasn't here to prove anything to them. He was here to survive. While the others wasted precious time theorizing, he had already moved to the next step. He retrieved a small cutting tool from his belt and began slicing into the frozen ground. Beneath the top layer of ice and dust, the soil was compact but workable. Using the natural depressions in the terrain, he started hollowing out a small trench. A proper shelter would take time, but if he could get even part of it dug before nightfall, he would stand a far better chance than those still struggling with blueprints. Hours passed, and the sky grew darker. Around him, the other students had barely made progress. Some had started assembling frame structures using lightweight metal rods from their emergency kits, but the high winds made it nearly impossible to secure them properly. Others had attempted to carve caves into the rock formations, only to realize too late that the stone was far denser than expected, requiring tools they hadn't brought. Frustration rippled through the group. Eric, meanwhile, had finished the outer wall of his shelter. The windbreak was complete, reinforced with layers of compacted ice to create insulation. His trench had been deepened, and a makeshift roof, constructed from layered rock and fabric from his pack, provided additional cover. It was crude, but it was effective. By the time the first night settled over Xephos 9, temperatures had plummeted to lethal levels. The cold seeped through armor and skin, biting into bone. Students who had dismissed Eric's approach were now struggling. Their half-built structures offered little protection, and the wind tore through the gaps in their designs. Some huddled together, sharing what little warmth they could. Others retreated into the emergency pods, too proud to admit they had failed. Eric sat inside his shelter, adjusting the thermal lining of his coat. The wind howled outside, but his small enclosure held firm. He had insulated the floor with compacted ice and layered heat-reflective material against the walls. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't freezing either. That was enough. As he took a sip from his water pack, he heard the unmistakable sound of movement outside. A shadow flickered against the entrance of his shelter. A moment later, Kirill crouched at the opening, her expression unreadable. "Your shelter," she said, her voice slightly strained. "It works." Eric met her gaze, then gestured to the small space beside him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. With only a brief hesitation, she ducked inside, closing the entrance behind her. The night stretched on, and the wind raged outside, but inside Eric's shelter, they survived. Eric woke before the first light of Xephos 9 broke over the jagged horizon. His breath was visible in the dim glow of his wrist device as he checked the temperature, a minus 90 degrees Celsius. The cold had intensified, but his shelter had held up through the night. The compacted ice walls reflected his body heat back at him, keeping the worst of the frost at bay. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves, ensuring they hadn't stiffened from the cold. He couldn't afford sluggish movements. Kirill stirred beside him, still wrapped in her insulated coat. She had spent the night in his shelter after realizing her own structure was inadequate. Now, as she woke, her blue skin was covered in a thin layer of frost. She blinked against the dim light and exhaled sharply. "You really built this in a few hours?" Eric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his pack, pulled out a small protein bar, and took a bite. Only after swallowing did he respond. "It's not much, but it works." She glanced at the ice-packed walls, the layered fabric overhead, and the neatly dug trench that had kept them from freezing. Compared to what the others had built, it was practically a fortress. She rubbed her arms and muttered, The others are going to struggle today." Eric pushed aside the makeshift covering at the entrance and crawled outside. The air was sharp enough to sting his exposed skin, but he ignored it. He had work to do. His shelter had kept him alive for one night, but 72 hours was a long time to be stranded on a frozen rock. If he wanted to make it through the next phase of the challenge, he needed more than just a hole in the ground. He surveyed the land. The other students were in bad shape. A few had managed to reinforce their structures overnight, but most were suffering from exposure. One group had abandoned their initial site and was attempting to rebuild near a rocky outcrop, hoping the natural formations would provide wind resistance. Another had given up on constructing anything and was instead huddled inside an emergency survival pod, its walls too thin to offer proper insulation. Professor Velcor stood near the landing zone, observing in silence. His reptilian features were unreadable, But Eric had no doubt that he was taking mental notes. The professor wouldn't intervene no matter how bad the situation became. This was a test, and failure meant consequences. Eric turned his attention back to his own work. The first priority was expanding his shelter. What he had built was enough for a single person, maybe two in an emergency, but if temperatures continued to drop, the others would start looking for alternatives. He wasn't interested in sharing unless it was necessary, so the best option was to make something sustainable before desperation forced anyone to his door. He started with the walls. Using his cutting tool, he shaved layers of ice from the surface of a nearby frozen ridge. The compacted snow underneath had hardened into an almost crystalline structure, perfect for reinforcement. He carved out large blocks and stacked them around the trench, creating a double-layered insulation barrier. The wind was still strong, but now it howled around his shelter instead of tearing through it. Coral watched him for a moment before shaking her head. "You're actually building a real structure. The others are still debating materials." Eric didn't stop working. That's their problem. She hesitated before stepping forward. "I want in. Show me how you're doing this." He glanced at her. She wasn't asking out of pity or camaraderie. She had realized that he was ahead of the curve and wanted to survive. He respected that. He tossed her his secondary cutting tool. "Start cutting blocks. Make them uniform in size. We need another 2 layers before we move on to insulation." She caught the tool and got to work. As the morning wore on, more students began to notice what he was doing. A group of 3, an insectoid Zathian, a broad-shouldered Valeran, and a slim-built Avioran, stood at a distance, observing his methods. Their shelters had been failing since the previous night, and now they were looking for alternatives. Finally, the Zathian stepped forward. His mandibles clicked together as he spoke. "You built a working structure. We underestimated your method." Eric didn't look up. "Yeah, you did." The insectoid hesitated. "Would you consider sharing knowledge? We will contribute labor." Eric exhaled slowly, weighing the offer. He had no intention of babysitting students who had ignored him earlier. But numbers had advantages. If they worked under his guidance, he could expand the shelter faster. He looked at Coril, who was busy stacking blocks. She didn't seem opposed to the idea. "Fine," he said, "but you follow my lead. No arguing, no wasting time. If you don't keep up, you're out." The 3 nodded, and within minutes they were cutting ice, packing snow, and layering blocks. What had started as a simple trench had now transformed into a multi-room enclosure capable of housing more than just one person. By midday, the changes were impossible to ignore. While the others still struggled with half-built designs and weak structures, Eric's team had constructed a fully enclosed space with layered insulation, heat-reflective surfaces, and a wind-blaking entrance tunnel. It was crude, but it was leagues ahead of anything else on Xiphos 9. Professor Velcor finally approached as the second sun of the system began to set. He surveyed the structure with a calculating gaze, his scaled arms crossed. "This is not what I expected from a human." Eric wiped sweat from his brow. "Good. Then maybe next time you'll stop underestimating us." Velcor's eyes flicked to the other students, struggling in the cold. He said nothing, but the approval was clear. Eric had not just built a shelter, he had built the beginnings of a colony. As the second night descended upon Xiphos 9, the temperature dropped even further. The thin atmosphere did nothing to hold in the residual heat from the system's dual suns, leaving the surface frozen in an almost absolute stillness. The only movement came from the relentless wind, which howled through the jagged rock formations, carrying with it razor-sharp ice particles that could cut through exposed flesh. Eric stood outside his newly expanded shelter, scanning the horizon through the thin visor of his helmet. His breath misted inside the mask, forming a thin layer of condensation that he wiped away with a gloved hand. He had learned from experience that the second night of survival training was always the worst. The initial energy and optimism of the first day had worn off, and fatigue was setting in. His team had done well. The structure was solid, reinforced with ice bricks and natural insulation. It wasn't warm, but it was stable. The entrance tunnel they had built kept the wind from cutting straight inside, and the packed snow walls reflected heat back toward them. It was still primitive, but it would hold. He glanced toward the rest of the camp. Not everyone had been so fortunate. The other students had struggled to construct anything beyond makeshift lintos and half-built shelters. Many had underestimated the complexity of the terrain, the instability of the ice beneath their feet, and the sheer brutality of the wind. Some had attempted to dig into the ground, only to hit layers of impenetrable frozen rock. Others had spent too much time debating theories, and not enough time working. Now, with darkness fully settled in, they were paying the price. Eric could hear the distant sounds of frustration, shouted commands, the occasional groan of effort as students tried to reinforce walls that were already collapsing under the pressure of the wind. One student, a red-skinned Threxian, had tried using a combination of flexible support rods and thermal fabric to create a dome-like structure. It had seemed like a good idea at first, but the constant wind had loosened the rods, and now the entire shelter was on the verge of caving in. He watched as the student desperately tried to secure it, his claws digging into the frozen ground for anything, to anchor it properly. But it was too late. A particularly strong gust ripped through the structure, sending fabric and support rods flying in all directions. The Threxian stumbled backward, cursing in his native language as he realized he had lost his only source of protection against the cold. Eric turned back toward his own shelter. He had prepared for this. He had known that some would fail. It wasn't his problem. Survival was about making the right choices, and those who hadn't done so were now facing the consequences. Still, he felt the weight of watching others struggle. He had been through worse, but not everyone had. Coral stepped up beside him, her blue skin illuminated by the dim light of their enclosed fire pit. "It's going to get worse," she muttered, hugging her arms to her chest. "Some of them won't last the night." Eric exhaled through his nose, considering his options. He wasn't responsible for them, but leaving them out there to freeze felt wrong. He pushed open the reinforced entrance of his shelter and stepped inside, feeling the immediate relief from the wind's relentless assault. The temperature was still dangerously low, but compared to the outside, it felt almost bearable. Inside, the others were already settling in, cutting rations into smaller portions, adjusting their insulation layers, and reinforcing weak points in the walls. He set down his pack and pulled out a thermal blanket, shaking off the frost that had gathered on its surface. "We've got extra space," he said finally, looking at Coral, "but I'm not going to waste time arguing with people. If they want in, they help. No dead weight." She nodded in agreement, already pulling on her gloves as she moved toward the entrance. Eric stepped back outside, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as he scanned the nearest failing structures. The Threxian was still standing in the open, his body shivering from the cold as he wrapped himself in the remnants of his collapsed shelter. Nearby, a group of 3 students, one Avioran, one Zathian, and a pale-skinned humanoid, were huddled together, their faces drawn with exhaustion. They had been trying to reinforce their structure with additional layers of packed snow, but the process was too slow. They weren't going to make it. He walked toward them, his movements purposeful. The Avioran saw him first, her bright, avian-like eyes narrowing as he approached. "What do you want, human?" she snapped, her voice sharp with frustration. Eric ignored the hostility. "Your shelter won't hold. You already know that. You have 2 options. Stay here and hope for the best, or come with me and actually make it through the night." The Zathian clicked his mandibles, his multi-jointed arms flexing against the cold. "And why would you offer this?" Eric sighed. "Because I don't want to deal with frozen corpses in the morning. You don't get a free ride. If you come, you work. Otherwise, good luck." He turned and started walking back toward his shelter, not waiting for an answer. He knew that desperation would make the decision for them. By the time he reached the entrance, he heard footsteps behind him. The Avioran and the Zythian had followed, dragging the 3rd student along with them. The Threxian hesitated for a moment longer before finally stumbling forward, his claws still clutching at his shredded thermal fabric. Inside the shelter, The newcomers shivered as they took in the reinforced structure. It wasn't luxurious, but compared to the freezing wasteland outside, it might as well have been paradise. Eric gestured toward a pile of insulated fabric. Take what you need. Then start reinforcing the entrance tunnel. The more bodies we have inside, the more heat we'll generate. But if you're dead weight, you're out. The Avioron muttered something under her breath, but didn't argue. She grabbed a block of compacted ice and began stacking it along the inner walls. The others followed suit, their movements stiff but determined. The night stretched on, the wind growing even stronger, but inside the shelter, they survived. The walls held. The temperature, though frigid, remained just high enough to prevent hypothermia. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't easy, but it was survival. Eric leaned against the wall, watching as the others worked. They had learned a hard lesson tonight. Some would remember it, others wouldn't. But one thing was clear. He wasn't just another student in this challenge. He was the one keeping them alive. Eric woke before anyone else. His internal clock had been honed through years of training. Early rising was a survival habit. The air inside the shelter was cold but breathable, insulated enough that none of the students inside had succumbed to the deadly chill of Xiphos 9's night. He sat up, stretching his arms and flexing his fingers to ensure that circulation hadn't slowed too much. Across the room, Coral stirred, blinking groggily as she pulled her coat tighter around herself. The others, the latecomers who had barely made it through the night, were still curled up in makeshift bedding against the insulated walls. Some were shivering, others barely stirring, exhaustion having overtaken them. The Threxian, who had nearly frozen to death outside, lay with his claws wrapped tightly around a folded survival blanket, his breathing shallow but steady. Eric pushed himself to his feet, careful not to disturb the others. His boots made soft crunching sounds against the compacted snow floor as he stepped toward the entrance tunnel. Pushing back the layered fabric they had used to block out the wind, he squinted into the frozen morning light. The storm had calmed, but the world outside remained just as merciless as before. The landscape was littered with the wreckage of failed shelters. Structures that had once stood were now half buried in ice, their materials scattered by the relentless wind. Some of the students had managed to reinforce their original shelters, but most of them had struggled, barely surviving the night in emergency pods or makeshift windbreaks. Those who had found their way into his shelter were the lucky ones. Coreel stepped up beside him, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice still rough from the cold. Eric exhaled a cloud of mist into the air. "We expand." She gave him a sideways glance, curiosity flickering across her blue-skinned features. "Expand? We already have enough to hold everyone who made it through the night. What more do we need?" Eric crouched, grabbing a handful of the frozen dirt beneath his boots. He crushed it between his fingers, watching as it crumbled into a fine powder. "Survival isn't just about making it through the night," he said. "It's about making it through every night after that. We need more than a shelter. We need a base. Something stable, something sustainable." Coral was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Where do we start?" Eric glanced back toward the entrance, where the others were beginning to stir. He had expected them to be sluggish, but to his surprise, some were already gathering their gear, moving with quiet determination. The fear of the previous night had hardened into something else. Purpose. He turned to Coral. "We need more insulation. The heat retention in here isn't enough. If the temperature drops again, we'll start losing people to frostbite." Coral crossed her arms. "We've already reinforced the walls as much as we could." Eric gestured toward the distant rock formations. "We need more than ice and snow. The rock outcroppings over there are dense enough to block the wind. If we carve sections of it, we can reinforce the walls properly. Less heat loss means better chances of survival." She let out a breath, then nodded. "All right. I'll get the Zathian and the Avioran to start cutting blocks. They owe us." Eric smirked. "Make sure they know that." As Coral moved to rally the others, Eric stepped back inside and surveyed what they had. It was still crude, just a few interconnected chambers reinforced with ice, but it was strong. The entrance tunnel had worked well to keep out the wind, and with a few adjustments, they could seal it even further. The Threxian had woken up, his reptilian eyes darting around the room as he processed his surroundings. When he saw Eric, he straightened slightly, his movements stiff. "You saved us," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Eric shrugged. "You saved yourself by making the right call. That's all survival is. Choosing the right move when it matters." The Threxian let out a low rumble, something between a nod and an acknowledgement. "Then the next right move is making sure we don't end up in the same position again." Eric agreed. The work began immediately. The Avioran and Zathian carved massive blocks of rock from the nearby outcrop, their claws and cutting tools slicing through the brittle stone. The Threxian reinforced the foundation, using his immense strength to pack ice and stone into layered walls. Coral led the efforts to create a secondary windbreak, ensuring that no matter how hard the storms raged, the entrance tunnel would remain intact. The work was exhausting. The frozen air burned their lungs, and the constant movement left muscles aching. But no one stopped. No one complained. The failure of the first night had humbled them, and now they followed Eric's instructions without hesitation. By midday, the structure had transformed. The outer walls were now twice as thick, reinforced with stone and ice to trap heat inside. The entrance tunnel had been extended, making it harder for the wind to penetrate. Inside, they had begun carving out individual sleeping alcoves in the packed snow, allowing for better space distribution. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a stronghold. As Eric stood outside, overseeing the work, he noticed Professor Velcor standing at a distance, watching in silence. The reptilian professor had barely interacted with the students since their arrival, preferring to observe rather than interfere. Now his yellow eyes studied the structure with a mixture of intrigue and something else. Approval. Velcor finally spoke. "You have exceeded expectations." Eric met his gaze. "That's what humans do." The professor's tail flicked, his version of a smirk. "We will see if that continues to be true." Eric didn't need validation, but the fact that even Velcor had taken notice meant something. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about proving that humans belonged in the stars, not as weaklings, but as innovators. As the second night approached, Eric looked at what they had built and felt a rare sense of satisfaction. They had come here as students. Now, they were something more. A colony had begun. The third and final day on Xiphus 9 arrived with an eerie silence. The winds had settled, leaving the landscape in a frozen stillness that felt unnatural after the relentless storms of the past 2 nights. Eric stood at the entrance of their newly reinforced shelter, scanning the horizon as the first light crept over the jagged rocks. His breath misted in the air, the temperature still dangerously low, but inside their stronghold, the cold was no longer an imminent threat. Behind him, the others stirred. Coral emerged first, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her blue skin slightly stiff from the chill. The Threxian followed, stretching his broad limbs, his scales clicking softly as he adjusted to the morning cold. The Avioran preened her feathers, trying to shake off the frost that had settled on the edges. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. They had survived. Eric turned back to face the structure they had built. What had started as a simple trench had evolved into a fully functional survival base. The thickened walls, reinforced with stone and compacted snow, had successfully trapped heat inside. The entrance tunnel now served as both a windbreak and a temperature buffer. Inside, the carved alcoves had provided better sleeping arrangements, preventing body heat from being lost in the open space. The rock formations they had excavated had been repurposed into makeshift furniture, flat slabs for seating, smaller pieces for tools and storage. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was proof that survival was about more than just endurance. It was about adaptation, efficiency, and above all, ingenuity. Eric watched as the other students from the academy began emerging from their own failed shelters, their movements slow and stiff. Some looked towards his structure with barely concealed resentment, knowing they had suffered while he and his team had thrived. Others simply looked exhausted, their faces drawn from the cold and the sleepless nights. Even the strongest among them had barely scraped by, relying on emergency rations and whatever protection their failing structures had offered. Professor Velcor arrived shortly after dawn. The towering reptilian figure strode toward the center of the survival zone, his yellow eyes scanning the area with a sharp, assessing gaze. His posture was rigid, his scaled arms crossed behind his back as he surveyed the results of the challenge. The other students gathered, their expressions wary, uncertain of what judgment awaited them. Eric stood at the front of his group, arms crossed over his chest, waiting. Velcor finally spoke, his voice low and measured. 3 days. 72 hours. That was the challenge set before you. His gaze swept over the students, lingering on those who had barely made it through the second night. Some of you have met expectations. Others have failed. A heavy silence followed. No one wanted to be the first to speak. The professor turned to inspect the remains of the failed shelters. He stepped past the half-collapsed structures, his claws clicking against the frozen ground. He examined the makeshift windbreaks that had done little to protect those who had built them. He knelt beside an abandoned survival pod, pressing a hand against the thin metal, feeling how brittle it had become in the cold. Then he turned toward Eric's shelter. He walked toward it with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes taking in every detail. He ran his clawed fingers along the reinforced walls, testing the density of the ice and stone mixture. He crouched near the entrance tunnel, noting the way it had been designed to redirect wind flow rather than block it entirely, preventing structural stress. He stepped inside, observing the carefully organized interior, the alcoves, the insulation layers, the heat-reflecting surfaces. When he finally emerged, his expression remained unreadable. Eric met his gaze without flinching. Velcor exhaled, his breath visible in the frigid air. "This is not a shelter," he said finally. "This is a base." A murmur rippled through the gathered students. Some exchanged glances. Others looked at Eric with barely disguised frustration. But Velcor wasn't done. He turned back toward the rest of the group. Survival is not about endurance alone. It is about adaptation, planning, efficiency. In the face of the harshest conditions, only those who understand these principles will persist. His gaze shifted back to Eric. "You have demonstrated that humans possess these qualities in abundance." Eric said nothing. He didn't need to. Velcor straightened, glancing once more at the structure before addressing the entire class. The purpose of this challenge was not to test physical resilience alone. It was to determine who among you could think beyond mere survival. Who among you could create something sustainable? Who could turn necessity into innovation? He let the words hang in the air before continuing. Only one of you succeeded in doing so. The unspoken truth settled over the group. Some looked away in frustration, others clenched their fists in quiet resentment. But the reality was undeniable. Eric had outperformed them all. Velcor stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Eric could hear. "I expected stubbornness from a human. I did not expect strategy." Eric smirked faintly. "Maybe you should start expecting more." Velcor studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Perhaps." He turned back to the group. "The challenge is over. Return to the shuttle for debriefing. Some of you will be reassigned, others will continue advanced training. Those decisions will be made in the coming days." He paused, his gaze lingering on Eric one last time. "For some of you, I expect new opportunities will arise." With that, the professor strode away, leaving the students in stunned silence. Coral stepped beside Eric, watching Velcor disappear into the distance. "You know," she murmured, "I don't think he's ever admitted he was wrong before." Eric exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Doesn't matter. What matters is we proved something today." She raised a brow. "And what's that?" He turned to face her, a slight grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "That humans aren't just survivors. We're builders." As the group began making their way toward the shuttle, Eric took one last look at the shelter they had created. In just 3 days, they had transformed a barren,